For this application, we will be using Axios, a promise-based HTTP client. To get started, we will need to install Axios using the terminal by running npm install axios. Once the installation is complete, we can now create our paystack API class. Let's create a file in API folder to hold our paystack API class. And within this file, we're going to define our class. And we'll create an instance. And we'll export that instance. For every API call, we would require an Axios instance to set up with custom and recurring configuration across different API calls like base URL, headers, and auth credentials. So let's go ahead to create a class variable to hold that instance, Axios instance, which is our class variable, and it's to be a type of Axios instance. We will need to store the backend URL in our environment variables. So let's create and store that. I've created a .env file and added two environment variables. One is the backend URL, which points to the base URL of our API. Next, we have the verification URL, which points to the donations path for our front-end application, where we'll redirect paystack to after payment is completed. We can now initialize our Axios instance in our constructor using the base URL we stored in the environment variable. We can use this .axios instance equal to axios .create, passing our base URL. Write backend URL. Now that we have this Axios instance, we can go ahead to make HTTP request calls to our API. For our donate page, we are required to initialize the transaction by making a call to the initialize payment endpoint. So let's create a function to handle this. Initialize. Going to be an async function that takes in payment details, which will be of type initialize payment args. So let's define this type. So to contain an amount of number, email, string, and name to be a string. Note that the initialize payment API also takes a callback URL. This is an override of the webhook URL specified on the paystack settings dashboard, where the response from the paystack checkout will be directed to. Also, our payment API expects the amount in Kobo. We would also need to modify this. So let's dive right in. Now that we have our data, we can make the HTTP call to initialize payment. Use await this .axios instance .post. It's going to be a post request, and the path from the API documentation is to paystack/initialize, and then we'll pass in our data as the second argument. So we can also properly type the API response data by passing a generic, but first let's define the response interface. Now we apply the generic to the axios call. Next, we destructure the axios API response, keeping in mind that it will be housed in a data attribute of the response. And we finally return that data. We can now create the second function to verify payment. Note that the function accepts reference as argument. This reference will be passed as query params to the verify payment API endpoint. So let's make the call. Await this dot axios instance dot get path is paystack slash verify. Next, we'll pass in an object where we specify the params, the query params that will be passed in our case reference. Let's properly type this axios call by defining a verify payment response interface. So we can properly type this just like we did for the initialize payment function. Now that we have added the verify payments response interface, we can now type get by passing in the generic and properly destructure our data out. Once we have destructured the data, we return the data. Now that we have paystack API class set up, we will be using Tanstack React Query, a package to help us abstract the data fetching and focus on displaying it in our app. It has hooks for fetching, caching, and updating asynchronous data, and general state management around data fetching. To get going, let's install this package using our terminal by running npm install Tanstack React Query. So React Query uses the provider pattern. So to set up React Query, we will need to create a provider. All these are in its documentation. So switching over to our code and to the app component, we will wrap our app with the query client provider from React Tanstack. As the name implies, we would need a query client. So we declare our query client, which is an instance of query client from React Query. I'll just go ahead and import this, and we'll pass that into the provider. In order to use React Query to manage our post request to initialize payment, we'll be making use of React Query's useMutation hook. Mutations are basically used to create, update, and delete data. In order to also properly separate concerns, we will be creating custom hooks. Firstly, we would create a use initialize payment hook. So I've created a file inside the hooks directory. useMutation takes in as argument the mutation function and an optional configuration. Let's start by creating our mutation function. which will basically be a call to the paystack API initialize payment function. To receive payment details of type initialize payment args, and here we'll return the paystack API dot initialize payment, passing in the payment details. We can now create our use initialize payment hook. Which accepts an optional config and returns use mutation from React query, accepting our initialize payment mutation function and the config. We'll export default use initialize payment. So let's type our config option. Should be of type use mutation options. That takes in t data generic t error. So now let's start defining what t data, t error, and t args are. T data is a data type returned by the initialize payment, and that will be initialize payment. I've added that type in our API class, so I just broke that out from the response data on the initialize response. I broke that out into a separate type so I can use it here. Next, the error. This would be of type axios error. Axios error takes a generic for proper typing, so let's create the API error type. So I added an API error interface here that has success and message and properties. Next, to move back to our hook and replace that with the error and import it. Finally, the t args are the arguments for our mutation function, the initialize payment args. Great job, guys. We are now ready to use our custom hook in the donate component. Note, useMutation is a lazy hook as it provides us with our mutate function that we can call when needed. So it does not just run the mutation when we call our hook in our component. That said, we can call use initialize payment in our component. Next, we destructure its value. We can access the is loading status, is success status, and of course our mutate function, which we can rename to initialize payment. We can now update our handle submit function to make use of the initialize payment mutate function. First, change this. And then we call our initialize payment mutate function, passing in the payment details. useMutation also provides us with some useful callbacks like the onSubmit and the onError, which we would take advantage of. Once the payment is initialized successfully, an authorization URL is returned in the response, which would redirect the user to. So let's implement that. In the case of an error, we can for now make use of the Windows Alert dialog box. We update the isLoading to a dynamic value from the hook. In addition to the isLoading state, we also want our form button to be inactive when the request is successful, because there might be a small lag from the success response to the redirection. Yes. Success. Great job once more. We can now test out donating. We'll ensure that our backend API is running. Also our front end, we'll start our front end application. Once the API is running, we'll navigate to the front end URL and fill the donations form, and we'll click the donate button. So this takes us back to the paystack checkout. This is a test environment, so we will not need to put any card details here. We can just go ahead to click the success button and pay. Nice. This leads us back to our callback URL, passing a query param reference, which we'll use to make the verify payment request to the backend to fetch the appropriate details for the donation. So let's dive right into that. If you've enjoyed this video so far, do like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and also turn on post notification to get notified when we post new videos to support the channel. Thank you. Let's turn our focus on creating another custom hook to help with payment verification. This time around, since we are making a GET request to our verify endpoint, we would make use of the React query useQuery hook. First, we'll create our file. Next, we'll define our function. Const use verify payment. We'll need a payment reference, which will be a string. Nice job so far. We now have the use verify payment hook set up. We shift our attention to using it on the donations component. First off, we need to get the payment reference. Remember, we specified the callback URL for our initialize payment API call, which points to the donations page route. Here, paystack will send the response with the payment reference as a query string, as shown during the checkout page on paystack. So we simply pull that data out of the URL before passing that to our hook. To properly do that, we would make use of React router DOM use location hook. And then we'll destructure the search. Next, to properly pull that data out, we would make use of the URL search params global object. Here we can make use of a getter, passing in the key which is reference in this case. Finally, we can now make use of our hook, destructuring the data, isLoading, and error. It will just ensure that the type will be a string, because it can actually be null. Our message string can take 3 forms depending on the state and response of our request. It could either be a success message, an error message, or a pending message when the request is being processed. To achieve this, we would make use of React's useMemoHook to help memorize our message string, which depends on the error, data, and its loading states. So now I've added the use memo to memorize the message string. So it will return a success response if we have data, and an appropriate error message if we have error, or the processing string will be returned. Let's go ahead to test our donations app. To test our application once more, we ensure that the API is running and our front end is also running. So we can navigate to the front end and fill the donation form and hit the donate button. It takes us to the paystack checkout page and we hit pay. Then it takes us back to the application. If you had looked closely, you would have seen the pending state processing before the success message. Thanks for staying tuned on this video. Do subscribe to the channel, share, and hit the bell icon to get notified when we release a new video to support this channel. Thank you.